Okay, we are now live on YouTube and we are ready to start. So I will just hide my video and mute myself and we're good to go. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dimitra. And thank you all for coming. Thanks all for attending. My name is Rhys Williams. I'm a lecturer at Glasgow and a member of the Fantasy Centre. And it is my great pleasure today to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Sourit Bhattacharya. He's also a lecturer here at Glasgow in postcolonial studies. His work ranges around the topics from colonial and postcolonial studies, disaster and food security studies, global realisms and genre forms, and Marxist literary criticisms. His first monograph, Postcolonial Modernity and the Indian Novel on Catastrophic Realism, was published by Palgrave in June 2020. And he's co-edited a volume of perhaps particular interest to this audience on the Indian left radical magical realist writer Sourit Bhattacharya, and that came out in 2020 from Bloomsbury. And he's also the co-founding editor of the open access peer-reviewed journal Sanglap, Journal of Literary and Cultural Inquiry. So today, Dr. Bhattacharya will be talking to us about radical imaginings, ecofeminist and subaltern utopias in India's colonial and post-colonial fantasy. So we have around an hour. I think Dr. Bhattacharya will talk for about 40 minutes, and then I will share a Q&A. If we can use the Q&A setting, the chat Q&A setting, to put questions, you can do it during the talk or after the talk. But that will happen at the end after Dr. Bhattacharya is finished. And I will now hand over for the talk. Over to you, Sourit.
Thank you so much, Rhys, for the introduction. I'll just find out if I can share my screen, and yeah, it's working all right. So you can see that, Rhys? That's great. That's wonderful. So I'll just put it on full screen. All right. So thank you, Rhys, again, and thanks also to the organizing team of Glasgow International Fantasy Conversations and GIFCon, as we know it, for having me here today. While it's been a very tough year for all of us, these past few days have been particularly challenging and heartbreaking for what's happening in my home country, India, right now. Researching and writing a paper has not been easy to start with. Seeing from a distance people unable to breathe and dying of the lack of oxygen, people desperately seeking help on social media for oxygen or grieving that they couldn't say a final goodbye to their loved ones has been devastating, to say the least. What has probably bothered me much is how governments have encouraged mass gatherings, election rallies, and religious festivals throughout these past months, when the spike was already noticeable. Images of dead people gathered for cremation alongside of those of rallies and festivals were too real to be true. In those moments, it did occur to me how contradictory and confusing sides blended to produce a catastrophic reality. As scholars of literature based in and out of these countries, we cannot ignore these sites. We think about them as we suffer. We talk and interpret to understand the underlying conditions that have led to this medical debacle, this humanitarian crisis, even when we are in the moment of crisis. Disbelief is the word that came to my mind often. Disbelief, puzzle, anxiety, and rage. I wondered as I wrote this paper that much of the modern fantastic, in South Asia at least, emerged from this sense of disbelief, a disaster, a national crisis, a civil war, an authoritarian government, wide sense of human suffering and loss, a spectacular collapse of systems at work, as they call it. The Fantastica, following John Clute's 2011 adoption of the term from its Slavic use, as the genres of fantasy, science fiction, and magical realism, which exhort us to think planetarily, is also an allegorical comment on the immediate crisis of ruins and catastrophe, as well as recognizing forms of cognitive or emotional redressal in older narratives of crisis, loss, and regeneration. How many times have we seen the world return to creative works, mostly works that question the recognized conventions of bourgeois realism, from Albert Camus' The Plague to Saramago's Blindness, to find some kind of therapy in the ongoing pandemic? So in this talk, I would argue that the fantastic does not only offer cognitive estrangement, in Darko Suvin's classical formulation, but in its modern South Asian urban reincarnation at least, it is deeply political. It offers the space for therapy, the ethics of survival and regeneration, of course, but also, and to me more importantly so, a radical form of imagining solidarity that questions and attempts to uproot contemporary oppressive conventions of neocolonialism, capitalism, class, patriarchy, and caste, and builds into it a revitalizing utopic tendency for a good life, a life of empowering the poor and the marginalized, and imagining a world of equitable distribution and environmentally sustainable co-living on this planet. My main example for this hypothesis will be a short story written in English, Sultana's Dream, published in 1905 by a Bengali and now Bangladeshi writer, Begum Rokeya Sakhawat Hossain. Initially, I thought about also to include the Bengali writer Sourit Bhattacharya, but as I wrote the paper, I realized that I might want to sort of focus entirely on this short story to kind of make my points here, and I'll be very happy to talk about Navarun's work in the Q&A if anybody is interested. So, and also about the slides, mostly the slides will be about quotations, so please bear with me as I read out. So first, before the short story, of course, first about fantasy and the political and the genre's modern reincarnation in colonial India. Rosemary Jackson, in her celebrated work, Fantasy, the Literature of Subversion, comments fantasy, and I quote her, characteristically attempts to compensate for a lack resulting from cultural constraints. It is a literature of desire, which seeks that which is experienced as absence and loss, unquote. Building upon these ideas of loss and supplement, Mark Bould and Cheryl Wendt have recently argued, and I quote, fantasy's subversiveness lies in its disruption of the smooth surface of the bourgeois social order as constructed in the mimetic novel. It does not constitute an escape into a made-up realm different from taken for granted reality, but constructs fictional worlds that are neither entirely real nor entirely unreal, but are located somewhere indeterminately between the two, unquote. Fantasy then is a political project, not only because it offers understanding of a recognizable but different reality, but also because it attempts to subvert or supplement what is marginalized or castrated in bourgeois representations of reality. An epistemological aesthetic project that fantasy is. Jose B. Monleon tells us that the fantastic genre emerged with the rise of urban modernity in Britain. Of course, he's talking about the rise of fantasy in Europe. It was born in the 19th century when mercantile and industrial capitalism attempted to suppress and supersede older feudalist forms of knowledge and belief systems, paving way for the return of the irrational in the form of the sublime and the Gothic as cultural forms integral to the material developments of society. In Monleon's words, and I quote, unreason was now the product of society, unquote, rather than a foreign intrusion into the social. What is observable from these comments is that not only is fantasy born as a political project, at least in these contexts, it is also irredeemably urban and industrial. What is, however, not discussed in these landmark studies on fantasy and the political is that industrial capitalism or bourgeois reality could not be possible without the rapid extraction and supply of raw materials and commodities from the colonies, or what historian Aditya Mukherjee suggested in his appropriate title of a 2010 essay on colonial economy, which is Empire, How Colonial India Made Modern Britain, unquote. These discussions in critical race theory, feminist, postcolonial, and globalization studies throughout in the 1990s made important breakthroughs in the postcolonial readings of the genre, as found in Nalo Hopkinson's and Upinder Mehan's groundbreaking collection, So Long Been Dreaming, Postcolonial Science Fiction and Fantasy in 2004. In a path-breaking work on Tolkien, perhaps the genre's most famous name, and Race, published in 2008, Dimitra Fimi shows how discourses of race and racism during Tolkien's lifetime influenced his medievalist imagination. And I quote from her work, when Tolkien started composing his mythology, it was still entirely legitimate and scientifically acceptable to divide humankind into race with fixed physical characteristics and mental abilities, unquote. In the same year, John Ryder, following Patricia Curl's case, Science Fiction and Empire, in 2007, published the very important monograph, Colonialism and the Emergence of Science Fiction, which argued that science fiction became visible in imperialist countries, primarily France and England, and then it fast gained popularity in other countries pursuing imperial projects, including the United States, Germany, and Russia. He explored here not only the colonial contexts and allusions in science fiction, but also if science fiction was allowing a methodological critique of what Slavoj Žižek calls, I quote him, ideological fantasy shaping imperialism, unquote. Such studies have then continued with Erika Höglund and Rima Sarwal's Science Fiction, Imperialism and the Third World, 2010, Eric D. Smith's Globalization, Utopia and Postcolonial Science Fiction, 2012, and more recently, Helen Young's Race and Popular Fantasy Literature, Habits of Whiteness, 2017, among others. Building upon these post-colonial and material readings of science and materialist readings of political fantasy, Pablo Mukherjee's Final Frontier, Science Fiction and Techno-Science in Non-Aligned India 2020 demonstrates how Nehruvian socialist developments in science and technology in a recently decolonized India and the internationalism of the Third World, that is ex-colonized Afro-Asian countries, which pledged to work together in the historic 1955 Bandung Conference in Indonesia, allowed for an emergence of an internationalist science fiction and fantasy genre in post-colonial India. This political impetus behind the fantastic in India could be located far back in the genre's revival in the colonial times during high British imperialism in the 1870s and 80s. The genre rose as a direct result of the establishment of colonial education and encouragement in science amongst the elite. Devjani Sengupta, in an essay on science fiction and Bengal from 1882 to 1974, tells us that rationality and scientific temperament was encouraged among the educated elite by mainly two competing schools of thought in contemporary Bengal, Derosian and the Brahmo Samaj. In her words, and I quote her, "This was because of a rapid mechanization of English businesses in the 1880s that led to a growing desire among the colonized Bengalis to master the alien technologies and sciences largely perceived as a remedy against superstitions and ignorance. It was a way in which colonial modernity could be mastered and understood," unquote. Such developments led to the early example of a science fiction story by Hemlal Boshu in 1882 called Rahosyo, or The Mystery. It is interesting to note that fantastic as a genre rose around the same time as novel in colonial India. This may be because writing a novel was a self-conscious practice of building a national or a regional's identity. Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay and then Rabindranath Tagore wrote famously about the lack of historical consciousness among the Indian peoples, especially the Bengalis, because while history, they argued, followed a teleological linearity based on empirical data and evidence, and narratives of triumph of civilizations in the West, in India, it was marked by a mixture of chronology, received notions, legends, and transmission of Puranic or mythological stories and knowledge coming down from generations. In this formation of the Indian novel, history then coincided with myths, Puranas, and agricultural and poetic traditions. Incidentally, the Sanskrit word for novel is upanyas, which means fiction, but also narrativizing, fictionalizing, poesis, plural times, and ending something justly. If we now note the Sanskrit meaning of fantasy, it's not very different from novel or upanyas. Fantasy means kalpa or creativity, both imaginative and imaginary. But it also means bidhan or bichar, bringing something to a righteous conclusion, to justice. The evolution of the term fantasy through fables and folk tales bears significance here, as most of these stories conclude with moralistic messages in India. Here, human and non-human worlds converge and converse, although in an anthropomorphic fashion, to come to an ethical conclusion that will make the world more habitable and less harmful for both, something that the Upanishads termed hitopadesh, or good advice. Note how a concept of good life or utopia is ingrained in the originary practices for fantasy in India. To come back to the colonial period, Novels and the fantastic rose together and drew from each other to build a historical consciousness of a nation's identity, as colonialism and the rise of Western utilitarian education system in India, following T.B. Macaulay's infamous Minutes on Education, which meant that the colonized would be understood as imitating, slavish, and childlike, as many philosophical theories of this nature, from Voltaire to Kant, Hume, Carlyle to Mill, suggested about the enslaved or the indigenous as inferior in culture and taste, of which Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask or Albert Memme's The Colonizer and the Colonized are exemplary critics. These genres offered a counter-argument to the racialized discourses of knowledge marked by a revival of cultures, forms, genres, literary and aesthetic traditions drawn from a pre-colonial past, and in many cases, rural cultural traditions. Just a minute, please. Right. A prominent example of this nationalist revivalism of culture is Rabindranath Tagore's introduction to Dakshinaranjan Mitra Majumdar's Thakurmar Jhuli, or Grandmother's Bag of Tales, 1907, touted as the key text or the oud text behind the popular rise of fantasy in Bengal. Mitra Majumdar wrote in his preface that he began to collect and rewrite these tales because they reminded him of his childhood and how mothers and grandmothers of rural India could recount these tales everywhere, now long lost with the arrival of urban colonial modernity. While the Hindu nationalist reimagining of the nation as mother goddess and its subject population as organically connected with agricultural traditions and rural cultures is unmistakable here, Tagore, in his introduction to the tales, adds a sharper anti-imperialist dimension to it. Consider his own words here, and I quote, "Is there anything as quintessentially indigenous to us as Grandmother's Bag of Tales? But alas, even this golden bag was being manufactured and sent to us from Manchester's factories until now. English fairy tales had become the main source for education and entertainment for our children. Our indigenous grandmother's company was completely bankrupt. Searching their bags, you might spot Martin's Ethics or Burke's notebooks on the French Revolution, but not the princes and fairies of our lives. Where have these princes and those speaking birds, Bengoma and Bengomi, gone? Where have the treasures of the 7 kings on the other side of the 7 seas and 13 rivers disappeared?" Unquote. Apart from its clear satiric anti-imperialism, what is also explicit is how many times Tagore uses the word Swadeshi or indigenous. 1905 saw the proposition from the Viceroy of India, Lord Curzon, to divide Bengal, the Bengal province, into 2 parts to administer it more efficiently, which meant mainly to effectively suppress the recent anti-colonial insurgencies in Bengal, as well as to divide the spirit of integrity through a religion-based partition, which, however, became an eventuality in 1947. While this proposition led to nationwide protests, the immediate impact was the rise of Swadeshi or self-rule movement. Tagore was one of the prime architects of the cultural political side of the movement, writing songs and supporting indigenous commercial and social projects. Fantasy and fairy tales, the fantastic, saw a spectacular revival around this time as a political project to mobilize cultural traditions-oriented political consciousness and to satirize the discriminatory conditions of life under colonialism. Sukumar Ray to Premendra Mitra to Leela Majumdar to the post-colonial fantastic, fantasy could hardly ignore this political side of self and collective mobilization in colonial and post-colonial India. I'll come to the story now. Begum Rokeya Sakhavat Hossain, Sultana's Dream, was published in Indian Ladies Magazine in Madras, now Chennai, in 1905, at the very helm of socio-political turmoil in India. Rokeya was a lifelong activist for women's education, a robust critique of the orthodoxy of patriarchy and religion in Hindu and Muslim societies and scriptures, and wrote almost exclusively in Bangla. This short story, however, written in English, which he then translated into Bangla, and we could always talk about this kind of interesting way of writing in English, and then also exposing the visions to a more wider reading world, to bring the vision back inward to the colony itself, is a very interesting gesture that post-colonial writers have used. And Rokeya is doing something in 1905, remarkably advanced. So this is a story about a place, Ladyland, where men have been outwitted and relegated to the secluded domestic space for men called Mardana or manliness, where they laze or chat around and sleep off time, which is modeled in a sense on Zenana or womanliness, or the women's secluded space in a Muslim household in her time. Women govern this place, Ladyland. They're strong, intelligent, and kind, and drawn to learning and science. Rationality and affection coexist in this society. Rokea's protagonist, Sultana, is bemused at the reversal of roles and shares thoughts with her guide, who is mistakenly called Sister Sarah here, suggesting her unquestioned absorption of patriarchal and colonial discourses of comparative anatomy, scientific racism, and religious injunction. While scholars such as Chloe Campbell in her work Race and Science, Eugenics in Colonial Kenya, or Helen Young in the earlier mentioned Habits of Whiteness have argued, these examples have direct relation with contemporary discussions in colonial imperial science, scientific racism, and sort of the discussions about anatomy and eugenics. But colonialism, patriarchy, and the native elite made sure that these ideas continued to rule society and women. This story does not only criticize the Parda or the Zanana system, which Rokeya has written extensively on in her non-fiction work, but proposes the reversal, that is, relegating men to seclusion and yet not imprisoning them against their wish. I'll come back to later. This aspect of governing a world with consent and yet radically changing it, overthrowing established traditions in a society which is not entirely different from the real world, the principle of cognitive estrangement, was radical enough for our own time and even today, which scholars from Bonita Bakshi to Muhammad Kyakyum to Sonia Amin have rightly pointed out. What has not been accorded much attention to my knowledge, is the environmental side of the story. I will focus on the example of renewable energy conjured up in the narrative, which should be able to suggest the kind of feminist, anti-capitalist, and anti-colonial radical imagining that fantasy as a genre or a political project allows for, at least in the South Asian context. During a conversation with Sister Sarah, Sultana gets to know that the queen, a connoisseur of science and technology, declared one day that all women in Ladyland should be educated and could not be married before the age of 21. She established all-girls schools, colleges, and universities. And 2 universities in particular began then to invent environmentally sustainable technologies for rain harvesting, solar heat trapping, and electric cars, which were then rubbished by men, the rulers and administrators of the kingdom, as, and I quote, a sentimental nightmare, unquote. As a war ensued and military might and administrative efficacy of men looked fragile, the enemy was defeated by the technological innovation of solar heat invented by women, leading then men to accept their role in Mardana. This heat also powers household activities, commercial and transport systems. So consider this passage, the first one. "Will you care to see our kitchen?" she asked me. "With pleasure," said I. And we went to see it. Of course, the men had been asked to clear off when I was going there. The kitchen was situated in a beautiful vegetable garden. Every creeper, every tomato plant was itself an ornament. I found no smoke, nor any chimney either in the kitchen. It was clean and bright. The windows were decorated with flower gardens. There was no sign of coal or fire. "How do you cook?" I asked. "With solar heat," she said, at the same time showing me the pipe through which passed the concentrated sunlight and heat. And she cooked something then and there to show me the process. Or this one, the next one. "Our fields are tilled by means of electricity, which supplies more power for the hard work as well. And we employ it for our aerial conveyances too. We have no railroad nor any paved streets here. Therefore, neither steel nor railway accidents occurred here," said I. Do not you ever suffer from want of rainwater?" I asked. "Never, since the water balloon has been set up. You see the big balloon and pipes attached thereto. By their aid, we can draw as much rainwater as we require, nor do we even suffer from flood or thunderstorms. We are all very busy making nature yield as much as she can," unquote. Apart from the remarkably ahead of its time renewables thinking, 2 aspects stand out here for my interest: conveyance and nature. There are no streets, roads, railways in this world. All conveyance is aerial, and the ground is a giant green garden, which I'll come back to. This is important for the critique of colonial capitalism here. Roads and railways are the prime markers of colonial modernity. Railways are often mentioned as the gift from the British Empire to India's rise to modernity. What is not mentioned in this kind of apologia is the relative ease with which resource extraction and commodity production could be mobilized across the nation now. More recently, environmental historians such as Jason Moore, Andreas Malm, and the Energy Humanities Research Group, in which Rees here is himself an interlocutor, have shown how massively coal or steam engine has contributed to the current crisis of the climate, so much so that geologists and historians have defined our living era of global colonial capitalism as the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene. In this story, the narrator reminds us that they didn't want roads or railways because they meant pollution. Of course, the language of climate crisis that we are familiar with today is not always available to Rokeya. But by the late 19th century, filth and pollution had already become a key debate in society, especially in imperial and colonial societies. Stephen Mosley's The Chimney of the World, A History of Smoke Pollution in Victorian and Edwardian Manchester is a solid example of this issue. Indeed, as Natalka Freeland tells us, that the utopian science fiction in the Victorian period by H.G. Wells and others repeatedly focused on the overt presence of the urban poor and filth in Victorian London and Paris, appearing at times as instructive manuals for waste management. Florence Nightingale's interventions in the Indian famines in the 1870s and the hygiene debates are exemplary here. While Nightingale became a household name in educated India for women empowerment and health debates, the city planning in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as Partho Datta's Planning the City or Mark Harrison's Climate and Constitution has showed, made green spaces and hygiene a key policy topic in the colonial cities. This is why botany, green space, and gardening are fundamental to this reimagining of the city for Rokeya. Indeed, Sister Sarah tells Sultana, and I quote, "Our noble queen is exceedingly fond of botany. It is her ambition to convert the whole country into one grand garden," unquote. However, botany in the 18th and 19th centuries was understood as feminine and thus a lesser science. As Anne Bishtyre in Gender and Modern Botany in Victorian England comments, and I quote her here, "Botany was a popular and fashionable activity in 18th century England, part of Enlightenment science of the taxonomic urge to collect and systematize nature in all its variety. Botany enjoyed cultural cachet and social sanction as an activity that combined amusement and improvement. The simplicity of the linear sexual system for naming and classifying plants according to the reproductive parts of flowers helped bring botany into prominence. During the later 18th century, women had more culturally sanctioned access to botany than to any other science. They collected plants, drew them, studied them, and named them, taught their children about plants, and wrote popularizing books on botany. Botany came to be widely associated with women and was widely gender-coded as feminine. Not surprising that the Queen's interest in botany or in the scientific religious notion of the kingdom as a giant garden was ridiculed by men as a sentimental nightmare. In the spirit of the current ecofeminist scholarship, such as by Henrietta Nichols-Sark's recent work on retrieving 18th century female botanists as contributing to a feminine green tradition, Rokeya's story not only draws from the colonial realities of pollution, hygiene, and a greener city planning, but also through a compulsive challenge to what Deepika Bahari calls the colonial masculinitist biopolitical thinking. But Rokeya does not stop with roads and railways, markers of a polluting modernity. Unlike for Gandhi's aversion to technology, Rokeya, an activist for women's emancipation, knew that technology was needed and could be beneficial if aligned with the way nature works. In some of her non-fiction works, she has written extensively on the use of nature and gender, and people have talked about that as well on her work. Nature becomes a key medium through which to imagine this beneficial use of technology. If we note the quote above, the one from Rokeya's from Sultana's dream, the important quote here is, "We are all very busy making nature yield as much as she can." That was the quote. A suggestion may arise here of exploiting nature through speed and extracting. But Sister Sarah tells Sultana that they do not work more than 2 hours a day because 9 to 5 is a regimentation that capitalism has chained us in, as men mostly while away time by chatting with colleagues or smoking cigarettes. 2 hours are adequate for pursuing scientific and administrative work. What is suggested in these lines is a management and organization of resources. As Moitri Chaudhary comments in a recent reading of Ecology and Virtue, in the story, and I quote her, "It is particularly useful here to invoke J.C. Davis's argument that what sets utopias apart from other ideal world narratives is that in them, neither humanity nor nature is idealized. Organization is the utopianist device to manage issues of supply, of satisfactions, with those of demand, of human desires. Efficient management of natural resources, solar heat and water balloons in this story, and time, for unlike men, they do not dawdle away time smoking, is what makes this utopia possible," unquote. Apart from this particular aspect of utopia and kind of optimal use of nature, note also the use of the word yield here, which has a religious agricultural connotation. That is, to yield means to produce, to pay, or to repay. Oxford English Dictionary tells us yield develops from a meaning of crops, return, worship, and sacrifice. This religious understanding of crops and food is still prevalent in agricultural societies, especially in India. People consider nature as mother goddess and a nourisher, and that she can be harnessed to yield produce. This imagery goes strongly for cows and cow milk too, a domestic and widely worshipped animal in India. Later, Sister Sarah tells Sultana that they dislike ownership of land and possession of wealth, and they do not trade with men who are habitual liars and exploiters. To quote her again, "Men, we find, are rather of lower morals, and so we do not like dealing with them. We do not covet other people's land. We do not fight for a piece of diamond, though it may be 1,000-fold brighter than the Kohinoor, nor do we grudge a ruler his peacock throne. We dive deep into the ocean of knowledge and try to find out the precious gems which nature has kept in store for us. We enjoy nature's gifts as much as we can." As you probably can note from this pictorial description of nature here, it is the depth reservoir of precious knowledge which it offers to humanity as a gift. Gift, as the French philosopher Jacques Derrida reminded us, is as much about giving as about radically withdrawing from the positionality of giving. Giving is a form of hospitality that recognizes the giver or the receiver, but does not bind them into a legitimate contract of return. What it demands in its anonymity of exchange is a recognition of the gift itself. Nature is the gift here, which the receiver must recognize. It is through collaboration between the human and the non-human, between labor and environment, that nature as a gift could be identified and harnessed. In a perceptive essay on the story, Suchitra Mathur comments, and I quote her at length here, "Sultana's dream thus envisions an end to the opposition between science and the feminine through the feminizing of science. This is accomplished not merely through making the available body of scientific knowledge accessible to women, but also through a fundamental revisioning of its methodology and purpose. While Hossein reconfirms the inextricable link between science and technology, she significantly alters the logic that governs the translation of science into technology. Within the dominant scientific paradigm, technology represents progress insofar as it allows man to overcome his natural limitations. It is this notion of technology as the overreacher that is reflected in the gadgetry that dominates traditional science fiction. From Wells's time machine, which allows man to overcome natural temporal as limitations, to more contemporary cyborg futures, whose electronic circuitry allows them to act as supermen. The role of technology in science fiction has been linked to increase in an invasive controlling power of man over nature and other living beings. In Sultana's dream, however, the technological innovations are designed to work in collaboration with nature instead of competing with it. The optimization of natural resources rather than material wealth is the driving force behind technological developments in Ladyland. Hossein thus redefined scientific progress by measuring it in terms of collective harmony, of how far we, not an I, can benefit from nature's gifts, not extracted wealth. It is this recognition of nature as a subject, as a living collaborator, rather than an inert object to be manipulated, which most clearly represents Hossein's feminizing of science as an activity," unquote. As Mathur continues, and something that is probably an important part of feminizing traditions of science for Mathur is that dreaming plays an important role here. Note that the title is Sultana's Dream. The dreaming plays the important role of blurring the material and the non-material, which is disallowed in Western colonial science. Dreaming, as Poorna Sengupta has argued in a reading of the story, is also important for its religious meaning. Islam, especially the Sufi tradition, uses dreaming as a way of not only revealing some fundamental knowledge of immediate social and individual crisis, dreams also have a tradition of curing and therapy. Perhaps the most famous literary example of this is the celebrated Bangladeshi writer Akhtarujzaman Ilyas's novel Khwabnama, or Dream Book, in which dreaming is shown to be a fundamental practice in social life in a Muslim fishing community, bringing collective forms of therapy for the community. What is important for our discussion here is that dreams, as a host of commentators, including Freud and Helen Sixou, have argued, are not very far from reality. They have every semblance of reality, but appears to us in a non-conventional, asynchronous, anachronistic fashion. Dreaming thus offers an important formal aspect to the story. It allows the journey to an ethically better, more equitable utopic world to take place, but also makes sure that this world is just another side of everyday reality. The technological and social revolution is just a matter of time. The speed with which the story moves from reality to dream in the beginning, and then dream, and then returns to reality in the end, suggests that the fantastic is hardly an unrecognizable extra-real world. The radical imagining of uprooting the current order in the story is thus given a realistic potential, a cognition through dreaming. And I come to my final paragraph now. What I have argued in the paper is that the fantastic in colonial South Asia has been a deeply political project, which envisions an overthrowing of the established patriarchal and colonial capitalist order for a better, more inclusive world. Rokea's story is a compelling example of such a project. In Anglophone academic circles, Rokea's story, even though written in English, may be lost to the examples by Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Herland or Virginia Woolf's The America I Have Never Seen. What I've tried to offer through this paper is on renewables in art in a globally connected imperial world is that we cannot afford to lose these stories any longer. As the Black Lives Matter campaigns have reminded us throughout in these past years, colonialism and slavery are not over. They continue to shape and haunt every moment of their lives, both in the metropolitan and in the ex-colonial. Decolonization asks for not only spotting or reading Rokea alongside Woolf or Gilman, but also to understand the specificity and historicity in which these texts were produced. As Nilo Hopkinson and Upinder Mehan wrote in their introduction to the groundbreaking So Long Been Dreaming, what this particular work has are stories, and I quote them, stories that take the meme of colonizing the natives, and from the experience of the colonizee, critique it, pervert it, fuck with it, with irony, with anger, with humor, and also with love and respect for the genre of science fiction that makes it possible to think about new things, new ways of doing things, unquote. So what this quote reminds us is that literary texts, syllabuses, pedagogic discourses, and recruitment practices have been shaped by dominant social knowledges that often were built by discarding or replacing local and marginalized discourses. For a decolonized fantasy, if I can use that phrase, we will have to continue to question not only established or received practices, as Hopkinson said, critique them, pervert them, even if this is revisionary or self-reflexive in our own practices. As Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay has proposed in a recent essay on a non-Anglocentric fantasy and science fiction, that it may begin with, and I quote him, the concreteness of our planetary imaginings, unquote. This conference, which has enabled us to come and think together of our concrete planetariness, of the shared global productions of unorthodox imaginings, and of the reactivation of knowledges and beliefs and texts that were relegated to the margins for centuries, is then a promising start towards that horizon of radical hope. With that, I stop here. Many thanks for listening.
Thank you, Sourit, very much for that Excellent and really fruitful and very productive talk. That was really, really enjoyable. So yes, everyone can shout out their thanks in the chat. There it is coming in. Almost as good as the waves of applause that would be actually greeting you in real life. That's it. If we could maybe have a machine that translates all the comments into waves of applause, you know, that would be nice. Brilliant. Okay, so the questions. If I can remind everyone to post their questions in the Q&A section. We already have one that's popped up there, but perhaps before I hand over to that, I guess I wanted to ask you, Sourit, if you don't mind me sort of leaping in at the beginning. I'll sort of abuse my my privilege as a chairperson. The question of the garden, I think, is really interesting as a figure, right? It has such a kind of long and complicated history in utopianism and in fantasy as a sort of retreat, right? And as you say, fantasy is kind of irredeemably urban and industrial. That was the kind of lovely way that you put it. And the garden obviously as this space of retreat, right? And as a kind of marker, I suppose, in the story that you were talking about there, of an alternative way of relating to nature. It's interesting then that the garden, I suppose, is this kind of double figure, that it's also a kind of figure of the management of nature, right? It can stand in for I suppose both sides of that coin. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about your kind of particular take on the kind of valences of the garden as a figure in this setting, if that's okay.
Absolutely, that's a great question. Thanks, Reese. And absolutely, I mean, garden, it also has a very strong religious connotation, right? I mean, garden, and then, I mean, they also eat fruit, only fruit. They don't cook anything else apart from. So clearly there is a kind of Christian and also Islamic and in Hindu traditions as well. So what I was interested in reading the story, and there have been religious readings of the story as well. I mean, where the story has been read in scripturally, so to say, critically, of course, about how she's thinking. So in one way, my understanding was that she, as an activist working in 1905, she couldn't be very radical in the beginning, right? And she said in the autobiographies and non-fiction writings that she didn't receive any help when she grew up. Of course, she grew up in an aristocratic landowning family, but she was disregarded throughout her upbringing. It was only her husband, way older than she was, who encouraged her to publish the story, first of all, and then also kind of continue to write sometimes radically on religion. So I think the garden here is also a reference to maintaining that kind of a status quo, not to sort of incite a population or a community in the first go, but it also has, as you said, it also has this very clear kind of managerial, I mean, not only the managing of resources, but I also was thinking about how she kind of molded it, that she wanted us to see the whole world as a garden, and garden along with hygiene and green space would always have an uplifting gesture. So it was the right choice in a sense for her. And she then had to think about how to talk about nature, right? I mean, you can't say that in that garden, you would continue to do what you do in order to produce technology and harness that for benefit. So she had to choose a word, having never written in English before. I think she's very specific here in choosing yield. And I was like very interested in using the word because a cow yields milk. That has a very long-term communal agricultural meaning to it as well, which probably could then bypass and retain that radicalness of reimagining, even for modern readers like us. So I was just thinking about that, but of course we can kind of expand upon it from retrospective theories as well. Yeah, I mean, a century before, it was probably really, in a sense, remarkably ahead in the way that she set it up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it made me think of Scott's Seeing Like a State, right? And that kind of distinction between, I suppose, like in indigenous agricultural practices, which were they rode roughshod over them, and they saw them as unmanaged and backwards and so on. But in actual fact, those were revelatory of a very long and intricate understanding of the kind of place and the soil and so on. So what in this story is perhaps like a female garden is also a kind of indigenous garden in that kind of anti-state sense, I suppose. Anyway, sorry, I should stop talking. There's some questions there. Can you see those questions? I'll read them out for the sake of the video as well. So we'll start at the top, I suppose. So Sandra has a question related to another author that you mentioned, Sukumar Roy. Hojoborolo, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is of course influenced by Alice in Wonderland, and I was wondering what the post-colonial implications of that are.
Yeah. Thanks, Lord. That's a great question as well. Yes, Hojoborolo is, it's called gibberish. Like Hojoborolo doesn't make any sense. So this was like Sukumar Ray writing, kind of following Edward Lear, and as Sandra has also pointed out, kind of Alice in Wonderland. So these were all available to Sukumar Ray, being part of the educated elite. So this kind of colonial imperial texts were readily available for Indians to learn from them as well, in a sense. But what he does, as Sandra was mentioning, was that he kind of twists as well. I mean, he throughout brings in indigenous fantasy traditions. As one of the panelists I was chairing was talking about, that how post-colonial writers kind of, and also Nello Hopkinson, who kind of says in that quote that we need to pervert it, we need to critique it, we need to twist it. So this is probably a fundamental post-colonial gesture of twisting things, to kind of disintegrating and allowing your voice seen in the same tradition, because you cannot start with a new tradition, because 3 centuries of colonialism have made your own literature as part of the literature of the metropolitan. So while the metropolitan is taught, the other way around is not always the same case. So what they are starting to do from the early 20th century is taking those, let's say, in a twist of manner, Franco-Moretti's raw materials from Europe, and then twisting it and making a product in the indigenous with the indigenous materials in the native land. So I was thinking, like, yes, that would be my post-colonial implication of what Sukumar Roy was doing in vis-a-vis Alice in Wonderland.
Well, actually, this possibly links then to the next question from an anonymous attendee, which is simply that they're asking, how do you think white fantasy authors can better understand this colonial history? Presumably the kind of history of colonial fantasy authorship there.
Yeah, the only way is to sort of, I think the first, and that is something that we are also probably doing in universities, especially everywhere in Britain or in kind of metropolitan countries, is to kind of, first of all, to diversify, of course, the syllabuses, to include more names. As I said, proposed in my conclusion, that it's not only that Roquea needs to be read. Of course, there are the story was written in English, so it's more available to, that it had to be known only in the 1990s is an irony, right? I mean, it was written in English. And that other writers writing from within the Anglo-European traditions were more known, again, is a reminder that how powers have worked throughout. So the point is not only to remember that Roquea wrote, but also to remember why she was not read for a long time, right? So that would require us to do something even more than just reading diverse texts in the syllabus. We'd also need to remind them the historicity of these texts, why they were not taught, and also the challenges of translating those texts, and the reading texts that were written in original languages, and realizing that some of the images, some of the jokes, as one of the panelists was also saying, might be lost on me. And that kind of a implicit understanding needs to be had. So it's a training, it's a long process that we need to be doing. It cannot be done with any kind of one-off or any kind of suddenness, because Black Lives Matter or the campaigns have showed that this will come back, because colonialism continues to shape our lives in the way that we think. So that, I think, could be a start to diversify, but also to acknowledge the radical histories of where they come from.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, we have 2 more questions. Let me have a quick look. Yes, okay, so Robert Maslin has one which ties actually back to the opening discussion that we had. I was fascinated by the idea of an ecological consciousness as an integral element of anti-colonial fantasy. Is this widespread phenomenon as you see it, or specific to certain writers?
Yeah, fantastic question, Rob. Good to see you. So yeah, of course, this is, I mean, if we think about colonialism or post-colonialism, colonialism is inherently an economic project, right? It starts with producing things and then supplying that to probably to Europe or elsewhere. So as a number of post-colonial eco-critics have argued, that colonialism cannot be read without environmental changes or damages that it had done. So reading colonialism only for culture would be incomplete. So whether writers have used ecological consciousness within their writing, I think that is a task upon us to find out, because when some people are writing, they're not always, I mean, these are also probably tasks of a critique to see the underlying conditions of what somebody writing and why somebody writing in this way. And if I'm reading, I mean, Sultana's Dream has been more dominantly read as a feminist text, but not as an eco-feminist text. But that, as you can see, almost 70% of the text is about renewable technology and the way that she's imagining that. So while it is so explicit in this particular work, in works by Sukumar Ray and other fantasy works, especially somebody that Pablo Mukherjee has written on Professor Shonku's stories, clearly that the social conditions of life are integral to the way the state or the government or the economy have conditioned your body, like the biopolitical reading of it. So I'm sure, like partly also is upon us how we choose to read them.
Yeah, and I mean, it occurs to me that of all the kind of fantastic genres, fantasy does seem to have this basic link between ecology and sort of the state of society in some sense, right? If one is sick, the other is sick often. So yeah, it's obviously it's a kind of world ecological genre in that sense. It's primed to talk to those kinds of those topics. Okay, we've got a couple more questions. I would like to hear a little bit about connections and boundaries between fantastic as genre and magical realism, specifically in Indian literature, and they highlight the God of Small Things as a piece of work that creates a lot of questions about reality and fiction. And that's from Graziella, I think that's how you pronounce that.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question again. I feel like that's a problem with using realism as the European term. I mean, something that I work on as well, realism, that when realism, what we know by realism was not always available to writers we're writing about. I mean, the way that George Eliot writes and the way that Flaubert writes, they're not writing in the same style, and they are using ideas, tropes, images, which might just be people have called this irreal or unreal. So realism itself was a challenging and kind of a debatable project in Europe. But when it came to India, if we think about the rise of novel and the rise of realism together, as I pointed out, a novel rose as a historical fiction. And Bankim Chandra, who was often said as the first novelist in India, was actually modeling his work after Walter Scott, the historical fiction. And this was a reminder that, okay, with the advent of colonial modernity, a historical past of kind of aura and heroes and triumphs of rural cultures was now lost, and it's upon me to bring that past back and to conjure up a nationalist consciousness. So in that sense, of course, the historical fiction itself is kind of realist, but at the same time, as we know, that historical fiction mingles with a lot of other forms. So when realism began, and people like Meenakshi Mukherjee and also Franco Moretti have commented that realism began in India as itself a mixed category where people were drawing from rural cultures, folk traditions, jatra, Purana, etc. So there was never like a derivative form of realism from Europe, if Europe is the standard here. So I would say that realism, because realism and fantasy, say novel and fantasy, rose together, had in dialogue with each other, both of them are equally fractured. And that's where I believe that it's very difficult to, say one novel by Indian writer is realist. People say that Salman Rushdie writes magic realist, Arundhati Roy writes, some other realist. So there is always an adjective qualifying the term. I would rather say they are all realists, because realism itself is a fractured genre in India.
Here. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Okay, we have one more question, and I think perhaps depending on how long your answer is, this might be a good one to end on, because it brings us to the present moment. So this question says, this made me think about a more recent Indian female author of science fiction, Vandana Singh, and the ways in which her utopianism is often built around a kind of fusing of the city and the garden, the city as a particular sort of curated green space, is part of the failure to see this as an ecofeminist work, presumably Sultan Stream, partly a failure of otherwise slotting it into a genealogy of Indian science fiction.
Yeah, Vandana Singh, absolutely. And Vandana Singh's, I was thinking about, I don't know what the author had in mind, the harvest as well. And it is about kind of, organ donation and harvesting of body parts. And I think as the author mentioned, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, who asked the question again? Aishwarya, yes. As you mentioned, Aishwarya, and this is a particular the rise of science fiction and fantasy in contemporary India, especially with a number of writers as Samit Basu and others. I can't remember the name of that author, but the novel is called The Devourer. And The Devourer is about, again, about from the urban fantasy to Sundarbans, the kind of mythical world that it wants, that Amitav Ghosh also writes about in The Hungry Trite and other novels. So the point here, I believe, is that for texts to be seen as ecofeminist or feminist or environmentally conscious, as I thought about this as well, that it is partly also upon us. I mean, like, writers choose to write in a particular way, and they probably it is going to be a completely mistaken idea if we say that they write in vacuum. They are mobilized by the contemporary historical and socio-political discourses, right? And everybody has to be. And it is a challenge how you bring those discourses now to a literary aesthetic form, a challenge that Rokia, I think, had when she couldn't just talk about what she was thinking about. She could always say that Sultana's, this was not a dream. By using the word dream in the narrative, she was pointing us towards a longer tradition of dream narratives, right? And what dreams would mean for our own culture and language and religion. Dreams have a very strong tradition in Indian, Hindu traditions as well. And then I'm sure like in Buddhist traditions. So dreams are fundamental. I mean, as a number of critics have talked about. So I think to some extent here is that how somebody writes, how somebody molds that historical and environmental discourse into an aesthetic form would be absolutely fantastic to know why. I mean, I always see aesthetics or form as a clue to understand how the author wrote and why they wrote in that way. So that could be, I mean, I know that I'm not answering your question adequately here, but it's just that I'm thinking about all of these things together, and Vandana Singh is probably a very good example in that.
Well, I think that's an excellent place to end. We've got 1 minute left. If everyone who is here would join me in thanking Dr. Bhattacharya, who has given us an excellent talk. Thank you very much, Sourit, from me personally. And yes, thanks everyone for coming. And I guess head off to the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sourit, and we'll see you out. You'll see all of the next sessions. But thank you so very much for that. And I wish we could have the roaring applause, but yeah, we'll have to make do with Zoom reactions. I'll close the session now. Thank you again, everyone. We'll see you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sourit.
See you.